But going back to what you mentioned, like if McClellan had won, what happens to slavery? In class, you floated a kind of related proposition about the 13th Amendment basically was sort of ratifying after the fact changes that had already happened on the ground. Or at least that's the sense I got. So, I mean, can you talk about this more? Like it's really a question about the relationship of sort of high politics to these like big structural transformations.
Well, structural transfer. The 13th Amendment was very important in making irrevocable what had happened on the ground. Slavery is an incredibly resilient institution. It has shown itself to be over history. The French abolished slavery in 1794 in their Caribbean empire. Napoleon reinstituted it in 1802. They had slavery again. The blacks were not too happy about this, but slavery then didn't last until 1848 in the French Empire. In other words, you can try to put the pieces back together again. Slavery was totally disrupted by the American Revolution, and yet they put it back together again in the South. In the North, it went on the path of emancipation. In the South, it grew, to an enormous extent. Slavery was disrupted by the war. Many people became free by the war. Now, if the North wins, which by that point is pretty clear they're going to, then the 13th Amendment is ratifying what is happening anyway. If somehow the Confederacy pulls a rabbit out of its hat and wins, Britain decides in January 1865 to intervene militarily on the side of they'd have been crazy, obviously, but intervene on the side of the Confederacy, something happens. It's possible that slavery could be resurrected in the South. I think that with the Union winning, the 13th Amendment is ratifying a fait accompli. There is no way after that war that slavery is going to be allowed to continue, regardless of the constitutional situation. But this was an era of constitutionalism, of people. One of the remarkable things about this period is people trying to fit into the Constitution situations for which the Constitution actually had no relevance.
Oh, I don't think that's just this period. It seems like a pretty big constant in U.S. history.
Well, it's true. I suppose constitutionalism is always in that kind of mode. I mean, after all, our Constitution is well over 2 centuries old, so it didn't anticipate, the Founding Fathers didn't anticipate everything that was going to happen.
It doesn't look a day over 150. Yeah.
Right. But they did believe in constitutional government, and putting it in the Constitution makes it totally irrevocable. But whether it was ratified or passed in January 1865 or June 1865 or September 18, it didn't really make much difference in the long run, that's for sure.
But so we've been talking about emancipation for a while now without asking the question, which is in a lot of ways how this is typically framed, who freed the slaves, which you said is just sort of a badly formulated historical question, which, I mean, I'd like to hear you talk about that more, especially because I think the idea that there could be a badly formulated historical question, it might sound weird to non-historians.
Well, there were plenty of badly formulated questions. I won't go into all of them now, but I think maybe it's the debate over that at a certain point became badly conceived because people were always looking for one answer. Who freed the slaves? Lincoln freed the slaves. No. Congress freed the slaves. No. The Army freed the slaves. No. The slaves freed themselves. There is truth in all of those answers, and in fact, it's all of the above is the answer, I think. So it's badly formulated to the extent that it seems to look for a single answer to something that has a multiplicity of causes. As we said a while ago, emancipation is a historical process with many, many actors. And all of those actors are contributing to the end of slavery. So I don't think you can come up with a single answer to that question of who freed the slaves. All of those groups I mentioned, and probably more, the radical Republicans, the abolitionists, have a part in the end of slavery.
And one group that is especially aggressive on this, even if people didn't think they would be ahead of time, military commanders. Someone in your Lincoln book, I forget who, maybe it's Butler, says, "While I'm in the field, I'm an abolitionist."
Right, I can't remember who that was, but they had to deal with reality and on the ground, and
even, I mean, well, you see McCurry, like Robert E. Lee, one of the first major figures in the South to consider enlisting slaves in the Army, offering emancipation as a consequence. On both sides, you see this connection between military conflict and emancipation.
Military commanders, when they entered the South, Union ones, discovered except in a few areas, the only loyal people were slaves. Mm-hmm. The only people who would give them any assistance were slaves. And armies need assistance. They didn't have GPS devices. They didn't have Google, Street View or whatever. They had maps which were mostly inaccurate. Mm-hmm. They would constantly be coming across topographical features that they hadn't expected. And they needed local knowledge. One of the advantages of the Confederacy is local knowledge. Their armies Lee's army knew Virginia like the back of their hand, They knew how to maneuver. They knew what the high ground was and all this they knew, whereas the Union Army didn't know. That's why when Lee moves into Pennsylvania, he's like blind. He doesn't know what's up ahead, beyond the horizon that he can see. He doesn't know where this road goes. Union Army faces that in the South. Slaves start giving them information, telling them you can get there this way, So whatever, even at the beginning of the war, when the policy of the government is don't let commanders accept these black people as people who can help them and thereby give them protection and start treating them as if they're free, even if they're not legally free. You're not sending a guy back to the plantation who's been helping your army maneuver in some part of Virginia, So reality has a way of trumping, policies coming down from Washington.